Huguette Clark owned more rooms than most people could ever use, and for the last 2 decades of her life, she lived in none of them. Not the 42-room apartment on Fifth Avenue, not the estate on the California coast. She lived in a hospital room in New York. That choice made her famous long after she had stopped appearing in public. Some people took it as proof that something had gone badly wrong. Others read it as evidence that she was living exactly the way she wanted to. Neither version explains much on its own. To understand why a woman with almost unlimited choices kept making her world smaller, you have to start with the man who gave her those choices and taught her to distrust what came attached to them. William Andrews Clark was born in Pennsylvania in 1839 and went west during the mining booms. He did not start out as a copper magnate. He made his first money selling to the people rushing toward gold and silver. The real fortune came later. In Montana, he saw what copper was about to be worth. Electrical systems were spreading across the country and turning the metal into one of its most important industrial resources. Clark bought into mines, smelters, railroads, and the businesses around them, and those holdings made him one of the richest men in America. The money did not buy him a clean reputation. He went into politics, and his election to the United States Senate collapsed into a bribery scandal. Investigators concluded that his political organization had used money improperly to win legislative support. It became one of the most notorious Senate election fights of the era, and it followed him even after he later returned to the chamber. The scandal reinforced a reputation Clark already had. Money was a tool for influence. His Fifth Avenue mansion made the same point in stone. 121 rooms, art galleries, elaborate staircases, private entertainment spaces, and decoration that drew attention even in the Gilded Age. Parts of New York society had shut him out. He had enough money to build something they could not ignore. By the time Huguette was born, Clark was an old man with adult children, enormous holdings, and decades of experience dealing with people who wanted something from him. His second wife, Anna LaChapelle, was decades younger. The relationship started privately in France before it became public, and the age gap drew comment. They had 2 daughters, Andrée, born in 1902, and Huguette Marcel Clark, born in Paris on June 9, 1906. Huguette grew up with tutors, art, music, travel, and servants, in a household where ordinary financial limits did not apply. What the money could not do was make anything simpler. In a family where wealth ran through business, politics, social standing, and private relationships, affection could be difficult to separate from interest. A young child probably could not have understood that. She would not have longed to wait. The first lesson came through loss rather than money, and it involved the person she seems to have loved most as a child, her sister, Andrée. The family moved from Paris to New York in 1911, when Huguette was 5. Everything around her became larger. The Fifth Avenue mansion, the art, the servants, the routines of one of the richest families in America. The person closest to her stayed the same. Andrée was 4 years older, and in a house with more than 100 rooms, the 2 sisters still shared a bedroom. Whatever comfort Huguette found, it did not seem to come from space or possessions. It came from having Andrée nearby. In 1919, Andrée became seriously ill with meningitis. She died at 16, close to her 17th birthday. Huguette was 13. The family's money could do nothing about it. What the family did next was keep her memory present. André's portraits remained on display. In Santa Barbara, Huguette later helped fund the Huguette Clark Bird Refuge. A cottage carried her sister's name, and so did a summer camp the family donated. None of that proves Huguette spent the rest of her life trapped by a single childhood loss. It does show a pattern. When someone mattered to her, she did not like letting that person disappear. Memory became attached to places, objects, and institutions that could remain when people could not. The pattern returned much later. Perhaps this was the first version of something that followed her for life. People could disappear, but objects could be preserved. A portrait could stay where it was placed. A house could be kept in familiar condition. A doll could be arranged exactly as she remembered it. There is no evidence Huguette consciously connected those things. But decades later, preservation would become one of the strongest patterns in her life. Another loss was already close. William Andrews Clark died in 1925 at 86. Huguette was 18. Accounts of her life describe a warning from him that stayed with her. Because of the fortune she would inherit, she could never be entirely sure why anyone wanted to be near her. Practical advice or something colder, it was difficult to forget. She already knew that people she loved could disappear. Now she had been told that the ones who stayed might have motives she could never fully verify. What if that warning did more than make her cautious? For the rest of her life, every close relationship could carry the same question. Do they want me or what comes with me? Huguette could buy almost anything. What she could never buy was certainty about another person's motive. After her father's death, Huguette and her mother, Anna, moved into 907 Fifth Avenue. The huge Clark mansion was eventually torn down. The fortune survived. So did the art, the properties, and the unusual closeness between mother and daughter. For a while, Huguette still appeared headed toward a conventional adult life. That version of her future had a name, William MacDonald Gower. Gower was a Princeton graduate and the son of a man tied to William Clark's business world. On paper, the match worked. Respectable background, connected families, and society pages that treated the engagement as exactly the sort of marriage a young heiress was expected to make. They married at Bello Sguardo, the Clark estate in Santa Barbara, in August 1928. Huguette was 22. They separated in less than a year. The divorce was final in 1930. Even by the standards of wealthy marriages that ended quietly, theirs was unusual. Gower later said the marriage was never consummated. Some accounts also suggest Anna had a large role in arranging it and may have offered financial encouragement to make it happen. Those claims deserve caution because the available accounts do not establish every detail. What is clear is that the marriage failed almost immediately. Huguette did not go searching for a second husband. She returned to Fifth Avenue and expanded her apartment until it covered nearly 2 full floors, about 42 rooms. She never married again. Around this time, the photographic record of her public life thins out and then nearly stops. One of the last confirmed photographs dates to about 1930. She is still young in it, carefully dressed, recognizably part of the society world into which she had been born. After that, public traces become much rarer. This was not yet the complete withdrawal for which she later became famous. Through the 30s and into the 40s, Huguette painted, collected, maintained chosen social contacts, and occasionally appeared at events connected to her interests. There was no single dramatic exit. She was changing the terms of contact instead. No single event explains the withdrawal that followed. Her sister had died young. Her father had taught her that wealth could make other people's motives difficult to read, and her marriage had offered little reason to believe that closeness would necessarily make life safer. None of those events explains Huguette on its own. Together, they help explain why distance might eventually have felt less like something imposed on her and more like something she could control. Over the next 2 decades, that distance grew. So did her involvement with art, collecting, and a private world outsiders later mistook for an empty one. Pulling back did not mean she stopped caring about the world. Instead, she concentrated more intensely on a smaller set of interests. Japanese art and culture held her attention in particular. She collected dolls, studied design, commissioned miniature theater settings, and paid close attention to costume and presentation. Details other people might have dismissed as trivial mattered to her. The work was precise, it stayed under her control, and she found it beautiful. In the 1940s, that interest stopped being entirely private. After Pearl Harbor, suspicion of anything connected to Japan spread across the United States. Huguette's Japanese collecting and wartime connections drew federal attention, and the FBI questioned her. The surviving details are incomplete, and later accounts disagree about how severely the episode affected her. Some describe it as contributing to a period of significant emotional strain and deeper withdrawal. It would be too much to say that one event caused everything that followed. Huguette had already been narrowing her social world for years, but the questioning may have reinforced a lesson she was already learning. Attention from outside was not always harmless. Sometimes it meant being examined. From then on, she increasingly preferred interests she could pursue without being examined at all. She still traveled to Bello Sguardo, occasionally through the 40s and into the early 50s. There, she painted, worked with the objects she loved, and spent time in a house that was familiar and carefully maintained. Her last visit appears to have been around 1953. She never returned. Her creative life continued anyway. On rare occasions, Huguette attended Christian Dior shows, not to participate in New York society, but to find ideas for dressing her dolls. That sounds eccentric only if the dolls are dismissed as toys. She owned antique French dolls, Japanese figures, contemporary toys, and elaborate miniature settings. She commissioned pieces and left detailed instructions about how they should be dressed and arranged. Her assistant later compared the collection to any other serious collection built around craftsmanship and personal interest. The collecting itself was not especially unusual. The privacy surrounding it was. Huguette also painted. She studied with portrait artist Tadej Stajka and had shown work publicly when she was younger. The paintings were not simply decorative exercises by a wealthy woman with time to spare. People familiar with her work described discipline, technical ability, and sustained attention. Withdrawal did not end her intellectual or creative life. She was still studying, still collecting, still creating, still making decisions. Her physical world was becoming smaller without becoming empty. Reduced public contact did not mean she stopped engaging with the world. She reduced exposure, not curiosity. Huguette continued following the interests that gave her pleasure, while removing more of the situations that demanded social contact she did not want. One person remained inside that shrinking world for years: her mother. Anna and Huguette had lived together for decades, and after William Clark's death, they became each other's steadiest company. The household grew increasingly private and formal, but Huguette was not living alone. Anna died in 1963. Huguette was 57. The loss reshaped her life far more than the divorce had. The circle tightened again. Visitors who had once been admitted came less often, and some eventually stopped being received altogether. Staff continued maintaining the Fifth Avenue apartment, while Huguette arranged her days so she rarely had to meet them. She stayed in one room while they worked in another. Notes carried messages that otherwise would have required conversation. She used French around employees because she believed it gave her greater privacy from anyone who might repeat what they heard. 42 rooms were being maintained for a woman who rarely allowed the people maintaining them to see her. Calling Huguette simply isolated, however, misses the relationships she continued to maintain at a distance. Newspapers kept her connected to current events. Television filled much of her day, from cartoons to dramas and talk shows. She recorded programs she enjoyed and sometimes passed them along to other people. A distant connection with William Gower also survived. The marriage had failed, but the contact never completely disappeared. Telephone calls and letters kept a small group of friends in her life. Suzanne Pierre, who had once worked for Huguette, remained in touch for years. So did her goddaughter, Wanda Stika. People who actually spoke with Huguette did not generally describe someone detached from reality. They remembered a woman who could be warm, funny, interested, and quick to ask detailed questions about other people's lives. Her generosity also continued. Money went to institutions, employees, and people whose difficulties she had read about in newspapers. Some gifts were enormous, and they did not stop with people who were physically near her. Huguette remained attached to people she never had to meet. Wanda once asked why she no longer went out. The answer, as later remembered, was simple. She did not want to. There was no long explanation, no theory for public consumption, no attempt to make her life understandable to anyone else. That distinction matters because later coverage often treated seclusion itself as evidence that Huguette could no longer make rational choices. Extreme privacy is not the same as incapacity. Her decisions could be unusual, expensive, and difficult for outsiders to understand, without necessarily meaning she did not know what she was doing. The isolation still carried a cost. The more tightly Huguette controlled access, the fewer people remained close enough to notice problems she could not handle herself. Regular medical care largely disappeared. Years passed, then decades. By the late 1980s, she was an elderly woman living almost completely outside any ordinary system of health supervision. The arrangement protected her privacy. It also left her vulnerable in a way she had not planned for. Huguette could decide who entered the apartment, who spoke to her, and how much of her life the outside world was allowed to see. Her own body was the one thing she could not indefinitely exclude. When it finally forced her back into public view, the place she entered for treatment became the place she refused to leave. In March of 1991, at 84, Huguette Clark entered Doctors Hospital in Manhattan. Years without regular medical attention had taken a toll. She was severely underweight and physically weakened, with advanced basal cell carcinoma that had gone untreated for years. Treatment began immediately. Surgeons removed the cancer, and reconstructive surgery repaired much of the damage to her face. She gained weight, her condition stabilized, and she recovered better than anyone seeing her on arrival might have expected. Then her doctors told her it was time to go home. She refused. Her refusal to leave the hospital complicates the usual image of a recluse. Huguette had homes, extraordinary ones. The Fifth Avenue apartment was professionally maintained and waiting. Belloscardo still stood in Santa Barbara. Another estate sat in Connecticut. She could have afforded nurses at home, private physicians, servants, security, and almost any level of personal care she wanted. Instead, once the immediate crisis passed, she preferred the hospital. Huguette later transferred to Beth Israel Medical Center and remained there for the rest of her life. Not another month, not another year, roughly 2 decades. The stay cost hundreds of thousands of dollars a year, which was the one type of problem she never needed to solve. The more interesting question is what the hospital offered that her houses did not. Meals arrived, medical help was available, access could be controlled at the door. She did not have to manage a household full of staff or receive visitors because convention expected it. Instead, she could occupy one small, orderly space while someone else managed most of what happened beyond it. She used another name there, Harriet Chase. What the arrangement gave her was privacy without complete solitude. That may have mattered more than the size of any room. Huguette could avoid the social exposure she had spent decades reducing while still seeing people every day. Could the smallest room in Huguette's life have given her more control than all the mansions she owned? At home, privacy required managing servants, property, visitors, and expectations. In the hospital, the boundary was one door. Someone else managed almost everything beyond it. Perhaps that was part of why she stayed. One relationship eventually moved to the center of that life. Hadassah Perry was a registered nurse assigned to Huguette's care. What began as a job became something much more intense. Perry worked extraordinarily long hours, brought food from home, and stayed when Huguette wanted company. She became one of the few people allowed into the closest part of Huguette's daily life. For a woman who had spent decades rationing access, that represented an extraordinary degree of trust. The gifts were enormous. Huguette gave Perry and her family money, housing, cars, tuition payments, medical assistance, and other forms of financial help. Over the years, the total reached tens of millions of dollars. From the outside, the relationship raised an unavoidable question. Was Huguette rewarding the one person who provided companionship in the only form she could comfortably accept? Or had a single caregiver acquired enormous influence over an elderly woman whose isolation left almost nobody else close enough to counterbalance that influence? Both interpretations would eventually become central to the fight over Huguette's estate. Perry's defenders pointed to years of care and companionship. They argued that Huguette understood her wealth and gave freely because she wanted to. Critics saw something more troubling. A private nurse possessed access that relatives, old friends, and much of Huguette's professional circle did not. As Huguette's world narrowed, access itself became increasingly valuable. There was another side to the relationship. Perry later described how much of her own life the job consumed. Long shifts, time away from her family, and an employer who often did not want her to leave. That makes the relationship difficult to classify simply as exploitation or devotion. Huguette gave extraordinary amounts of money. Perry gave extraordinary amounts of time. Whether that exchange was equal, healthy, manipulative, affectionate, or some mixture of all four became almost impossible to determine after Huguette was gone. And there is an uncomfortable contradiction. Huguette had spent much of her life living with the idea that money could make affection difficult to trust. Yet with Perry, money became part of the relationship on an extraordinary scale. Was it simply generosity? Or had Huguette eventually begun using wealth to preserve the one form of companionship she was still willing to accept? There is no evidence that she consciously understood the relationship in those terms. The simpler fact is that Perry stayed close. And when Huguette died, Perry was there. For most of those 2 decades, however, Huguette was not dying. She read newspapers, watched television, arranged dolls, talked with people she trusted, and did all of it from a hospital room while some of the most valuable private residences in America remained empty. Outside New York, the contradiction became even more striking. Belloscardo had once been one of the Clark family's great retreats, yet Huguette had not set foot there since the early 1950s. The estate was never allowed to decay. Staff remained, gardens were maintained, rooms were cleaned, art, books, instruments, furniture, and decorative objects were preserved. The longtime estate manager, John Douglas, spent decades running a house whose owner never returned. None of that was cheap. Keeping a large oceanfront estate in first-class condition required continuous labor and expense. Huguette paid for it year after year. The Fifth Avenue residence followed the same pattern. Its rooms remained maintained while she was absent, and employees continued working for a woman who had first avoided them while living inside the apartment and then stopped living there altogether. Connecticut added another layer. Huguette had bought a large, secluded estate there in the 1950s as a possible refuge during the Cold War. It never became a real home. For decades, her properties remained available and largely unused. To some observers, that appeared to be waste on an almost unimaginable scale. Why maintain enormous houses in which nobody lives? There may have been another logic operating beside the extravagance. Huguette spent much of her life holding on to things she would not completely release. Her sister's name, her art, her dolls, the family houses, rooms preserved in familiar condition. The properties may have functioned less as active homes than as possibilities she refused to close. She did not have to return to Belloscardo. As long as it remained intact, she still could. The public knew almost nothing about this arrangement until much later. In 2009, journalist Bill Dedman noticed the Connecticut estate on the market and became curious about its owner. The property had been maintained for years with little indication that Huguette Clark had ever truly lived there. What he found was stranger than an empty house. The elderly heiress who owned it was alive. She was living in a New York hospital and had been there for years while mansions worth millions remained ready for a return that never came. The story reached a national audience, and an obvious assumption followed. A woman making choices like that must no longer have been mentally capable. Medical evaluation complicated that conclusion. Huguette was described as cognitively sound, engaged, aware of current events, capable of conversation, and able to make decisions. That does not prove every financial decision she made was free from influence. It does make one explanation much harder to sustain. The empty houses were not by themselves evidence that Huguette had lost track of her own life. They were choices. Extremely expensive and highly unusual choices, but choices nonetheless. And they protected exactly what she had spent decades refusing to surrender. By then, another question had become unavoidable. She could keep the houses waiting while she was alive. What would happen to them, and to a fortune worth hundreds of millions of dollars, after she was gone? By 2005, Huguette was 98 and still living at Beth Israel. The people handling her financial affairs had been urging her for years to make a will. The reason was obvious. Her fortune was still worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Valuable real estate, major works of art, personal collections, and assets accumulated across generations. There was no clear final plan for most of it. In March, she signed a will. It was relatively simple. Hadassah Perry would receive $5 million. Beyond that, much of the estate would pass under ordinary inheritance rules to relatives descended from William Clark's children by his first marriage. There were roughly 19 of them. Most had little or no personal relationship with Huguette. Some had never met her. Others had not seen her in decades. That arrangement may have seemed unusual, but legally it was understandable. Huguette had no children and no surviving sibling. Without instructions directing the estate elsewhere, distant relatives stood to inherit an enormous fortune. Then, 6 weeks later, she signed another will. It was different in almost every respect. The relatives were excluded. A large share of the estate went to charitable purposes, particularly a new Belos Guardo Foundation connected to the Santa Barbara property, along with the Corcoran Gallery of Art. Wanda Steica, one of the few people with a genuine personal connection to Huguette, received a substantial bequest. Perry was positioned to receive tens of millions more. Huguette's lawyer, Wallace Bach, and accountant, Irving Kamsler, were each named for smaller bequests and given important roles in administering the estate. Beth Israel Medical Center was included as well. 2 documents. 6 weeks apart. The same fortune pointed in 2 completely different directions. Why allow distant relatives to inherit most of it and then remove them almost immediately? After Huguette's death, that contradiction became the center of the estate dispute. Huguette Clark died on May 24, 2011, just weeks before her 105th birthday. Hadassah Perry was with her. The second will soon went to court. Huguette's relatives challenged it, and their argument went beyond simple disappointment at being excluded. They said she had been vulnerable and isolated. They alleged that the small circle with access to her during her final years had exercised undue influence. They also questioned her mental capacity. The evidence they used revealed something larger about the case. Her dolls, her cartoons, her unusual living arrangements, her extraordinary generosity, behavior that had made Huguette appear eccentric to outsiders for decades, was now being offered as evidence that she might not have been capable of deciding what to do with hundreds of millions of dollars. Her supporters interpreted the same facts differently. They pointed to a woman who read newspapers, followed current events, communicated clearly by telephone, discussed art in detail, gave specific instructions, and appeared to understand the people and property around her. Liking dolls did not establish incompetence. Neither did watching cartoons. Neither did choosing to live in a hospital. And giving money away did not, by itself, prove that someone else had made the decision. That became one of the most important distinctions in the case. A choice can appear strange without being an incapable one. The reverse also remained true. Being mentally capable does not make a person immune to influence. Huguette had created a life in which very few people were close enough to influence her at all. That made access valuable. Perry had a great deal of it. So did the professionals managing Huguette's legal and financial affairs. The relatives had almost none. As the dispute moved forward, investigators examined those relationships more closely. What emerged did not fit into one simple explanation. Irving Kamsler, the accountant, had an unrelated felony conviction from 2008 involving online conduct. That conviction did not prove he had manipulated Huguette's estate. But it raised an obvious question about why someone with that record remained in a position of financial trust. Wallisbach presented a different concern. He had helped draft the wills and was also named as a beneficiary and executor. The person helping construct the estate plan therefore stood to receive money and fees through it. A conflict of interest is not proof of coercion, but it added another layer to a case already defined by how few people had access to Huguette. Then there was the hospital. Reports emerged that Beth Israel had sought larger donations during Huguette's long stay, and the institution was included in her estate plan. That does not establish that the hospital controlled her decisions. It does sharpen the central problem. Nearly everyone close enough to help Huguette also had something to gain from her wealth. Her physical isolation created other vulnerabilities. A Degas pastel disappeared from the Fifth Avenue apartment after Huguette entered the hospital. Years later, it surfaced with a collector who had apparently purchased it without knowing it had been taken from her collection. An FBI investigation eventually identified the work. The theft was separate from the dispute over Huguette's will. But it exposed another contradiction. Her wealth could still be reached, even while she believed she had created a life designed to keep unwanted people out. The estate dispute was heading toward a jury trial when the parties settled in September 2013. That distinction matters. No jury found Huguette incompetent. No judgment established that Perry, Bach, Kamsler, or the hospital had maneuvered her into signing the second will. The settlement divided the estate. The larger moral questions remained unresolved. The relatives received tens of millions of dollars in total. Perry received nothing further from the estate and agreed to return $5 million from gifts Huguette had made during her lifetime, while keeping much of what she had already received. Bach and Kamsler surrendered their bequests and administrative roles. Charitable interests still received substantial assets. And Bellosguardo was preserved through the foundation created from Huguette's estate. Nobody got everything they wanted. Perhaps that was appropriate, because the evidence never collapsed into a clean story of victim and exploiter. Maybe Huguette knew that relatives she barely knew expected to inherit her money and deliberately decided against them. Maybe the people who gave her company and professional support became disproportionately important because she had removed almost everyone else from her daily life. Maybe gratitude, dependence, affection, isolation, and influence were all operating at once. The documents can show who received money. They cannot reconstruct the private calculations of a woman who spent most of her life preventing outsiders from watching her make them. Which leaves a question more interesting than the fortune. Who was Huguette Clark when money was not the subject? Much of the public coverage treated her as a puzzle: the billionaire in the hospital, the woman with the dolls, the owner of empty mansions, the heiress whose relatives and caregivers fought over hundreds of millions of dollars. All of those descriptions contained truth. But people who actually spoke with Huguette often described someone much less sensational. Paul Clark Newell Jr., a distant relative, began speaking with her by telephone in the 1990s and continued for years. His recollections became part of the biography Empty Mansions, written with Bill Dedman. The woman described there was alert, humorous, curious, and often surprisingly conversational. Huguette asked questions. She followed other people's lives. She discussed her interests with precision. She wanted almost no physical exposure to the outside world. That did not mean she was indifferent to the people living in it. Her giving extended far beyond Hadassah Perry. Huguette sometimes read about people facing hardship in newspapers and sent financial help. She gave generously to employees, supported artistic and charitable causes, and continued sending gifts to people working at Bellosguardo, decades after she had last seen the property. There is a revealing contradiction in the advice she gave to others. When Wanda Stika lost her mother, Huguette reportedly urged her not to live alone. Coming from a woman who had spent decades organizing her own life around physical separation, the advice carries unusual weight. Huguette may have understood perfectly well what isolation could cost. That contradiction is more useful than trying to diagnose her from a distance. She did not necessarily reject human connection. She changed its terms. Telephone calls were acceptable. Letters were acceptable. Employees could be cared for from a distance. A nurse could be deeply trusted. Someone could even be allowed into a house Huguette herself would never enter again. Barbara Doran, the daughter of Bellosguardo's longtime estate manager, later recalled wanting to walk through the property again. Huguette gave permission. The door was opened. That small decision captures something important about the larger story. Huguette had not entirely abandoned the world, she controlled the route in. The woman who avoided visitors could authorize someone else's visit from thousands of miles away. The woman who never returned to Bellosguardo continued deciding what happened there. And the woman whose relatives later cited isolation as evidence of incapacity was still making detailed decisions about people, property, gifts, and art. None of that means every decision she made was wise. It does not mean every relationship around her was healthy. And it does not rule out the possibility that extreme isolation left her vulnerable. But it does challenge the easiest version of her story. Huguette was not simply a confused old woman hidden in a hospital while other people controlled her fortune. Nor was she a perfectly independent eccentric, completely untouched by the influence of those closest to her. The truth appears harder than either version. The question is not whether Huguette's life contained tragedy. It clearly did. The harder question is whether those losses ultimately took away her ability to choose how she wanted to live, or whether that ability, however unusual the results appeared from outside, was one of the last things she refused to surrender. Huguette died on May 24, 2011, just short of her 105th birthday. Hadassah Perry was beside her. Huguette had made clear for years that she did not want a public funeral. She was buried quietly in the Clark family mausoleum at Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx. She never returned to Bellosguardo, and after entering the hospital in 1991, she never returned to the Fifth Avenue apartment. The Connecticut estate was eventually sold. So were the Manhattan apartments. The possessions Huguette had preserved for decades began moving into the world she had kept at a distance. Bellosguardo passed to the foundation created from her estate. Limited docent-led access eventually allowed visitors into rooms that had been maintained for decades without their owner. For the first time, people could see what she had preserved: the art, the furniture, the instruments, the portraits of André. Her life had not simply disappeared. Much of it had remained behind closed doors. Huguette's own paintings also received renewed attention after her death. Work created by a woman remembered mostly for empty houses, hospital rooms, and dolls began to be considered on its own terms. There was real tragedy in her life. She lost her sister while still young. She inherited a fortune that complicated trust. Her marriage failed almost as soon as it began. Her world narrowed further after her mother died. Isolation contributed to years without proper medical care. And the fortune she tried so carefully to control ended in a bitter legal fight among the people around her. But tragedy is not the same as total helplessness. The available evidence suggests Huguette continued making many of her own decisions far longer than the caricature of the confused, eccentric heiress allows. Those decisions were not always easy to understand. Some may have increased her vulnerability. Some cost extraordinary amounts of money. Some placed heavy burdens on other people. And some protected exactly what she appeared to value most: privacy, familiarity, control, art, memory, and relationships conducted at a distance she could tolerate. So was Huguette a woman destroyed by fear and loss? Or a woman who responded to them by constructing a life almost nobody else would have chosen? Probably neither explanation works on its own. Loss shaped her without fully accounting for her. So did wealth. So did isolation. None of them, by itself, proves that her agency disappeared. She spent much of her life trying not to be seen. Once she was gone, the world became more determined than ever to define her. If you want more stories that recover the person behind the legend, subscribe.